Welcome, everybody, to the session on Platform as a Product. I am Luca Galante. I'm a core contributor to the platform engineering community at platformengineering.org. You might have seen that, or you might have seen PlatformCon, which is the largest platform engineering conference out there. And I host that. I also write Platform Weekly that goes out to about 100,000 engineers every Friday. So that's me. And today we're going to talk about Platform as a Product. But before I get there, I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes really on, why are we even talking about this? Why are we talking about platform engineering? Why is it relevant? Is it relevant? And the reason is this, right? It's graphs like this where you really can see this incredible rise and growth of the platform engineering ecosystem. This is whether you look at the numbers from our community, the one that I was describing, whether you look at the platform engineering YouTube channel, the Slack, PlatformCon, and so on. But you don't have just to take our words for it. You can also just check, very established analysts and players in the space, in the industry that have been around since I think the 70s or so, like Gartner, who I remember, speaking to the Gartner analysts for the last few years, and back in 2022, they added platform engineering to the software engineering hype cycle. You can't really see it, but it's this red arrow over here. In 23, you can already see it climbing the hype cycle. And then, of course, what do you know? In 24, last year, platform engineering actually got its own hype cycle, where you see things like internal developer portals, internal developer platforms, and other things on it. So clearly, there's like a lot of momentum around this. And in fact, Gartner has also named platform engineering as a top strategic technology trend for the last couple of years in a row. And frankly, from my personal anecdotal experience, if you think about, every time I talk to people like Gartner, at ThoughtWorks, at Google, there's like large players. Everybody's like, look, if it wasn't for AI, platform engineering would be the number one trend in enterprise today. And I think it's interesting that those two things are actually sort of overlapping and combining now going forward. But I digress. The point here is that according to Gartner, by 2026, 80% of engineering organizations, especially kind of like mid-size, large-size, and enterprise ones, will have some sort of platform engineering initiative in place, right? And so this is really where everybody, every CIO, every executive team is really looking at this whole platform engineering thing and kind of trying to figure out, okay, what can it do for me, right? And so just defining this really, really quickly. So, if we really just look at it, in a box, platform engineering is a discipline, right? That is really about taking all the tech and tools that you have sort of floating around, especially in enterprise engineering organization today, and bonding them together into golden paths, right? That abstract the underlying complexity, that shield the individual contributor, the developer, from the complexity of your setup, the growing complexity of your setup, which is usually a hybrid of cloud native, on-prem, and so on, right? And so the sum of those golden paths is an internal developer platform, or IDP for short, which is the end product of a platform engineering initiative or a platform engineering team that is really aimed at, essentially driving standardization, driving automation across your setup, as we will see more in detail later, right? As well as driving compliance, governance, security by design across all your workflows and all your development teams, right? So that's just getting out of the way a couple of important definitions. And if you are curious, what is a platform? What does internal development platform look like? This is an example of a reference architecture for an IDP on AWS and GCP, so a multi-cloud setup. And there's a lot of these things, right? I recommend, if you're curious, to go check out platformengineering.org/tooling. You'll see the entire landscape, as well as all the reference architectures that practitioners have used as a guide to talk people through their setups, through their platform engineering setups, especially PlatformCon 24, as you can see here. But we're now adding more and more from the community as well. So definitely recommend you taking a look at that. All right, so now let's get into the actual juicy bits. Platform as a product. What it is, why does it matter? So first of all, let's start with the definition. And this, I took this from Evan Botcher in 2018. where he basically describes, this is before platform engineering was called platform engineering, before IDPs were a thing, right? And he was really describing, he said, like a digital platform is this foundation of self-service APIs, tools, knowledge, documentation, right? And support that are arranged as this compelling internal product, right? And so through that lens, a platform team you can look at as effectively its own little startup team that is building and shipping a product for its own total addressable market, which is effectively the size of the engineering organizations, or how many users, how many usually application developers mostly are present in that engineer organization, right? And this is really interesting because it's very, very important, when we think about platform as a product as a key differentiator from, for example, DevOps, SRE, and sort of like previous disciplines and previous roles to platform engineers, right? Platform as a product is really this idea of like treating, building a product and treating developers as your internal customers, right? And so it's really that mindset shift that is so essential, and that essentially creates then this, platform team that functions as its own little company. And in fact, I even have plenty of anecdotes of larger enterprises like Salesforce and others, where actually they had multiple platform teams competing with each other for this total addressable market, right? So you can really see this as kind of like a self-contained product team that is going to market. And just to double click on what we just said, this is very, very important because there's a shift that needs to happen from, again, the traditional DevOps mindset of like, okay, I'm just adding more infrastructure, maintaining the infrastructure, and then teaching developers, right, how to use that, to actually, let me pre-package that infrastructure into a self-serviceable layer, which is a product, which is this, internal developer platform that developers consumes. And so you have a huge shift there from an ownership perspective, right? Because this is no longer a one and done 6 months infrastructure project and then I move on to the next thing, but actually is a product that has a life cycle of 5, multi-year life cycle, right? And in a lot of enterprises that we see in the community, 5+ years, is really the minimum that you need to account for if this thing is ever going to work, right? And actually really accelerate your time to market and so on as a large engineering organization. And so again, as part of that shift, you're also now looking at developers no longer as this, people that you kind of teach how to use infrastructure to, but as customers to whom you're providing this product. And the moment you treat your platform as a product, really, which is really what we're talking about here, the interesting thing is all these memes, right? All these ideas and best practices that have emerged in the last 20, 30 years are automatically unlocked for you and for your platform engineering organization, right? Because now if you treat your platform as a product, you can use best practices on how to do user research, user-centric design, having a proper platform roadmap, building these very tight feedback loops with application developers and other users, as we will see today, as well as of course, product marketing, right? Which is, again, such an essential part that I think often gets forgotten by platform engineering teams because we're engineers and we're just focusing on the building bit of it. But really, such an essential part is actually going to market with that product and listening to developers and what they want, right? And so again, it sounds simple, but you'd be surprised how many people, especially coming from sort of an ops DevOps background, struggle with this shift. So I'm just wanting to point that out. And of course, this is not the only challenge, right? There are other challenges, I think, especially when you zoom out and you look at engineering organization around really being able to treat your platform as a product. First and foremost, I think a general shortage of a good product management talent, right? It's interesting because not only I think in general these profiles, a profile that is both able to spar from a technical perspective with, ops, DevOps engineers who have like 15, 20 years experience in the industry, and at the same time has the communication skills to sell up to executives and down to developers and across to other infrastructure and security teams and so on. In itself, that Venn diagram of skills is quite rare. And then on top of that, I think you add the fact that in a lot of organizations, the good PMs are actually allocated to external facing products, because internal facing products is seen, again, not as products, but mostly that, drive revenues and improve bottom line and cut time to market, but actually as cost centers, right? And so again, both of those things contribute to a general shortage of PM talent. Of course, you also have a lot of politics, which is something that again gets trickier. It's it's always true, but it gets even trickier when it comes to internal products, because you don't have that instant feedback loop or very efficient feedback loop of the market, right? If I'm selling a product externally to my customer base, I can see whether a marketing campaign is working or not working, sales are up or down, right? You don't really have that oiled feedback mechanism when it comes to an internal product, right? And so what that means is that you have things like the meme on the right, where a CIO can just come in and just like, hey, we're going to do this instead, because it's really about who has more power a lot of times, as opposed to what is the best idea. And of course, in general, change is scary, right? The important thing to understand about any platform engineering initiative is that it's not it's both a technical and a cultural transformation, but I still have to see a single platform initiative fail because of a tech issue, right? Oftentimes developers, platform engineers get stuck in this idea of like, is it Terraform? Is it Pulumi? Is it Spacelift? What am I going for here? And the reality is like, that's rarely that's an important decision for a lot of reasons, but it's never usually the thing that is going to determine the success or not of your platform initiative. It's always a cultural thing, right? Can you drive developer adoption? Do you get executive support and buy-in? Can you do those things, and can you advance with that or not? And that's where it's a big change, right? It's really about like a large cultural org transformation, and of course that is scary. At the end of the day, you can think of an enterprise as an organism, and it's sort of like nature. In nature, change is something that is usually repelled, right, by most organisms, right? You're optimizing for maintaining the status quo, and this is true of enterprise organizations as well. Metrics is another very big I think issue that we're slightly going to touch on later as well, because it's very easy, I think, to get an approval, to get a mandate to build a platform, and then get all excited and kind of, okay, let's get started, without first understanding what is the baseline, like what are we actually trying to improve here, and then again, and that again goes back to sort of like best practice around product management, and really making sure that you have a very good understanding of what it is that you're building for and what are you improving, and then you continuously measure and iterate on that, and feeding that data back into the different stakeholder groups that care about that thing, right? About their specific metrics. And this is how you can continuously drive success for your platform engineering initiative. The final challenge that I wanted to point out is just a general, I think, tendency. Again, I believe because most platform engineering teams still don't see themselves as full-on product teams. And so they kind of fall into this very simple trap of kind of product management on 101, which is like listening too closely, right? Let's go, but I built this feature, is exactly what developers had asked me for. Why am I getting no developer adoption, right? And the problem is, like, I think very well exemplified in this quote by Ford, which is very famous, right? Like, if I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have just told me a faster horse, right? As opposed to a car. And that's kind of the idea here, right? That you really want to do correct user research. Again, once you unlock that kind of like meme by looking at your platform as a product, and listen, but not too closely, right? And so those are just like some ideas and pointers in terms of like what we still see in the community are some big challenges around being able to treat your platform as a product and driving product management best practices across your platform engineering organization. And kind of to answer to those, I put together a few best practices here that we've really condensed from top performing platform teams and kind of what works, what doesn't. And so I'm just going to go quickly through them. Because I think they're quite important. So the first one is really this idea of like not reinventing the wheel, and this is the first one because, in my opinion, is probably the most important one. In terms of I really believe that the value of a platform engineering team is in this what I call the last mile optimization, right? So it's not about kind of rebuilding everything from scratch that's out there and focusing on building this entire stack, right, of your platform, but really looking at platform engineering as this toolbox of both commercial and open source solutions that are out there in the wild, and figuring out what is the best combination for my engineering organization, and how can I glue together different tools with the existing tool chain, with the existing workflows that are present already in my organization, and bind them into these golden paths that drive automation, standardization, and so on across my organization. That is the name of the game. And I think the problem is that we see a lot is because platform engineering is still a relatively new discipline, still nascent, you see a lot of platform teams trying to do everything, right? Because we're engineers, we like to build everything. But the problem is there's a bit of a tragedy of the commons where it might be something that's interesting for you on an individual level or on a team level from the platform perspectives, like playing with the latest shiny new tech, but it doesn't actually it doesn't optimize the value that you create for the rest of the organization, right? And that's really I think, again, because of a lack of maturity in general, right? Because if I were to tell any infrastructure team, hey, I have a bunch of containers over here, what could we do to orchestrate them? Pretty much everybody would be like, okay, well, let's implement our own self-hosted Kubernetes instance, or do a managed service with one of the cloud providers, whatever. Right? You wouldn't go and build a container orchestrator. And I think the same, and I think the same will be true, and it is already becoming more and more true for platform teams around this backend of platforms, front end of platforms, and the different components of your internal developer platforms. But I think a lot of them still fall into this trap of let me build everything from scratch. And the problem is, it takes forever to do something well. You're competing with all the open source, all the commercial offerings out there. It takes you a year, you're 18 months, 24 months in, and then you look around and you kind of fell behind the rest of the market. You still have no developer adoption, right? So this is why this is really number one, and making sure that you really focus on taking what's out there already and figuring out, okay, what is really the tweaking that I can do as a platform team? Because the reality is nobody knows your engineering organization as well as you do. And this is where it's important that you are the one doing those last mile optimizations, because I've maintained open source toolings like Score. I've of course built also commercial offerings like Humanitech. It doesn't matter how many people I talk to. I actually don't know the peculiarities of your specific organization. You're the only one who does. And so I think that's really where you can create most of the value. So that's number one. I'm going to go through a little bit faster on the other ones. The number two is, again, sticking to well-established things, concepts, and architecture patterns. So, looking at a platform is just like any other application. You're a front end, you're a back end. You're much better off starting with a back end and a front end, and I'll leave it at that. Everything is code is always a great, I think, principle to have versions of your code to being able to roll back and forth your not just your application, your features code, but also your configuration code. We talked a lot about building golden paths for developers. You want to make sure that you strike the right balance between a golden path versus golden cage, right? So you want to abstract the complexity, but you don't want to remove too much context that they feel like, okay, I'm just like a monkey clicking the button here and I don't understand what's going on, because that's definitely going to kill developer adoption for you. be Pareto efficient. This is really the idea of like essentially, which is slightly different than the 80-20 Pareto principle, but it's a similar idea, just adjacent, that basically is centered around like, hey, you want to make sure that you make at least a group happy. That you make like basically like one or two stakeholder groups very, very happy, like developers and so on. You make their life 10x better, which again, if you think about that in an enterprise, in most cases today, it takes you like 2 weeks just to get a Postgres or whatever piece of infrastructure provisioned. A platform can really deliver a 10x or even more orders of magnitude of improvement to that developer experience. So you really need to focus on making a few stakeholder groups really happy. But the important thing is that you don't get anybody mad essentially at you, right? So the important thing is that your platform engineering initiative is in some cases a net positive, and it should be a big net positive, but it's never a net negative for anybody. Is at worst a net neutral, and this is how you make sure that you don't make enemies, right? 6, leave the interface choice to the developer. This is a little bit connected to 4, right? This idea of like you want to abstract complexity, but not too much that they feel completely abstracted away. And then you really want to make sure that you are driving security, governance, and so on by design across your setup. Although there are important principles, there's important caveats to this around minimum viable platforms, or MVPs for short, and really this idea of like don't overdo it at the beginning, because your MVP is not supposed to be super secure and just optimized for development environments. And then after that, but you should design the end architectural state with security, with governance in mind, and then start measuring from the beginning. This is the thing that we mentioned in the previous slide, right? It's tempting to get dive in and start building things, but it's really important, I think, to have a baseline of measurement, and then you constantly measure that to get that stakeholder buy-in and to keep driving stakeholder adoption across all the different groups. And you need to do this from day one, right? And this is kind of like how 8, 9, 10 you can combine in one bigger piece, right? So hopefully those are just like 10 helpful best practices. So now where do you start, right? And there's really like 5 helpful steps, I think, that again, we put together looking at a lot of different teams. And the first one is really, okay, define and understand your why, right? So why is your product important? What problem is it solving? How's it helping the different stakeholder groups, right? Where they might be over or under engaged across these different things, right? So that's number one, ask the why. The second is identify the target personas and their pain points, and then transform, number 3, those pain points into value propositions. And then again, measure, and then decide on the communication, the feedback loops to keep driving that improvement, right? And so we've looked at 1 over here. If we go to 2, it's an image that some of you might have seen on social, or if you're familiar with the platform engineering community already. But it's really this idea of like you have a core platform engineering team that drives at the heart of your platform engineering initiative, and then you have all these different stakeholder groups, right? And it's very important whether you're a team of like 2 people, in which cases you need to wear these different hats of like head of platform, infra platform engineer, DevOps platform engineering, and so on, or you are a team of like 200-300 people in the platform engineering org, which we have seen, in which case you're probably going to have dedicated subunits that tackle these different things, right? Whichever way it is, the important thing is that those are roles, those are functions that you think of when you think about your platform engineering initiative, because you really need to, again, in order to build it as a product, make sure that you get the input of the different sort of stakeholders around you, and that you bridge those gaps, right? So for example, developers over here, right, are usually a kind of like the main user that everybody has in mind for the platform, which is very much correct. And so a lot of the focus in platform engineering is around really what's called DevOps platform engineering, right? So really like building the right interfaces, focusing on the front ends and so on. The problem though is if you over optimize on that, this is something that we've seen a lot in the community and broadly in the market, essentially you're leaving behind your infrastructure and operations teams, right? Your I&O teams over here. You're not kind of selling the initiative to them. They're going to block it. Probably they're not clear on like how this is, what is it doing for them, and similarly to people like security teams, architects, and so on, right? And so you can see how it is very, very important to map these different stakeholders and make sure that you're measuring their baseline at the beginning, and constantly communicating how you're delivering value to them, right? And the important thing is to focus on where they suffer, what the real pain points are, right? This is a very interesting slide that Daniel Bryan presented at PlatformCon 22, the first one, where he's basically mapping sort of like this, different personas, right? Like developers and infra and app architecture, and how the responsibilities grew, and the tools that they're exposed to grew over time in the last 20 years. And you can see just like the complexity increases, and then it kind of like maps this like cognitive load, which is really, the integral of this like pink curve, right? And just like how it completely explodes, right? And, I think we're all familiar with situations like this where developers are completely overwhelmed by, just the sheer amount of tools that they need to touch just to do a simple deployment and a code, test a code change. And so they rather just like, hey, I don't want to touch this. I'm going to wait. And then essentially they create a ticket for the ops counterpart who are constantly feeling these ticket ops, putting out fires, doing this very manual, repetitive work, and which then creates all sorts of like standardization problem, automation problems, security problems, and of course, this just creates a general low productivity environment and a lot of friction between these different groups, right? And so when you think about that, you really want, when you're thinking about platform as a product and driving your platform engineering initiative across these different personas, you really want to make sure you turn those pains into values, right? And so again, if you map here, we just talked about developers, right? Cognitive load, they're just stuck waiting. Everything is very slow. There's no self-service. And on the flip side, infra and ops team, I know teams where they're just like, fighting ticket ops, which results in cost spiraling and in configurations that are not secure and so on. And so you want to have, right, going back to this circle here, right, the DAGs platform engineers, the infra platform engineers, you want to have the counterparts that effectively are communicating with developers to drive, to implement workflows and interfaces through your platform that drive automation, that enable self-service, while at the same time driving standardization, driving security, driving governance by design across all of your workflows and all your teams. And of course, ultimately, those things will play into a general, the way I frame it, you can frame it many different ways, cutting time to market and so on. But really, I think it's about moving faster, not necessarily fast as an absolute, because especially for a lot of enterprises, that's not necessarily something that they even want to achieve, especially if you're in a very regulated environment, right? But you want to be able to move faster, to innovate faster, to have faster, innovation cycles without breaking things, right? But having the certainty that your developers are moving in, faster in this paved roads where maybe before they were like very bumpy dirt roads and they could only walk because they didn't want to hurt, and now they can really sprint ahead, but there's really very defined guardrails around them so that they can do so securely, right? And again, the important thing we said, right, step 4, I believe, is this idea of measuring, right? And so how do you measure? And there's a lot of frameworks that you can use. One is this, the platform engineering maturity model, which some of you might be familiar with. This is from the Tag App Delivery Group at CNCF. And there's a source down here, so you can just go check out the entire paper, which is quite dense. And here you can see, right, an example here is as you can position yourself across this different sort of dimensions, right? This investment dimension, adoption, interface, and so on. And then like, where are you 1 to 4? You can think of it, and kind of like do this exercise of like, oh, I started over here with a portal, but there's still like no measurement. That measurement is a doc. We have run a lot of kind of like surveys around this, and actually the vast majority, I believe something like 80% plus, if you think about the measurement bit, does ad hoc, which essentially means they don't really do it, or when they do it, it's not really well thought out. And that is one of the major challenges. Again, I keep going back to this, but I really believe it's very important around building platforms as products and driving platform adoption. Is you need to measure where you start from and every step of the way, so that you can keep playing it back to the different stakeholders, right? There's other success metrics that you can use. This is a framework that we've started developing internally at the community, that can sort of where you can think about, like, okay, what's the onboarding time of a new developer, right? So the time to the first PR divided by the 10th PR, or how long does it take you to create a new service? Like, there's a bunch of different metrics that and custom sort of things that you can create, right? But the important thing is always really thinking about this as a multi-stakeholder problem, which is really what platform engineering at the end of the day is, and kind of driving the value proposition of the platform across these different stakeholder groups. And this is both developers, infrastructure, and operations team. We haven't really talked too much about security, architects. There's a bunch of others, legal and compliance, and of course executives, which are really instrumental, right? So you really need to win all of these folks over, or at least, like we said, be Pareto efficient and not piss anybody off, excuse my French, right? And really just drive this forward across all these different stakeholder groups, right? And that's really it. If you want to find out more about the platform engineering community, there's plenty of stuff. There's over 35 different media groups with 30,000 plus members all over the world. There's PlatformCon, of course, which is coming up now at the end of June. It's completely free for the virtual bit, or there is live days both in New York and in London on the 25th and the 26th of June. So if you're around, definitely come say hi. And then, of course, if you really want to take this seriously, we do have in the community now a certified practitioner and a certified professional. These are instructor-led courses that really go in depth into everything that we kind of touched on today and a lot more. And that's really it. Thank you so much. Thank you to the folks at IaCConf and Spacelift for giving us the opportunity to chat today. And yeah, if you have any if you have any questions, come find me in the community. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.